The 1960s was one of the most revolutionary decades in fashion history, a time when the world's social, cultural, and political fabric unraveled and rewove itself in new and unexpected ways. No longer confined to the aristocratic streets of Paris, fashion was now defined by the masses. The world was changing fast, and the clothes people wore reflected that, seemingly with the speed of a runaway train. What started as a delicate balancing act between tradition and experimentation exploded into a clash of cultures, colors, shapes, and ideas, all rooted in the desire for freedom. At the dawn of the 1960s, the last echoes of the 1950s were still firmly planted in the fabric of fashion. The 1950s had been a decade of post-war conformity, where the ideal woman wore nipped waist dresses, high heels, and polished hairstyles, dressed in the language of grace and elegance. High fashion was led by the likes of Christian Dior, who established the iconic new look in 1947, and Coco Chanel, who, though in her later years, continued to exert influence with her timeless elegance. Fashion in the early 1960s still held on to these traditions but began to bend, offering hints of the liberation that was to come. The early part of the decade saw figures like Jacqueline Kennedy setting the tone for American fashion. As First Lady, Jackie became an iconic figure, synonymous with polished style and effortless sophistication. Her wardrobe was a collection of beautifully tailored suits, modest cuts, and high collars, pieces that were simple yet striking in their refinement. Designers like Hubert de Givenchy, who dressed her for many public appearances, and Oleg Cassini became synonymous with her brand of chic American style, ushering in an era of practicality, but also quiet opulence. But by the middle of the decade, the tides were changing. Fashion's locus was shifting, no longer dictated solely by Paris or the French couturiers. The youth culture was now dominating the scene, and their ideals were reflected in their attire. A new generation was coming of age, and their voice was not just heard, it was seen. In 1964, the fashion world witnessed the arrival of something entirely new: the mod look. Born in London, the mod style was a stark departure from the elegant, ladylike silhouettes of the past. The mod movement was about youth culture, about celebrating individuality, and about throwing off the stifling traditions of the older generation. The clothes were short, sharp, and daring, designed to be noticed. At the forefront of this movement was Mary Quant, whose miniskirt became the iconic garment of the era. The miniskirt was a revolutionary statement, a symbol of freedom, independence, and the rejection of old norms. It was no longer about hiding the body under layers of fabric. It was about celebrating it, showing off the legs, and exuding confidence. Quant's clothes were designed for women who wanted to move, dance, and be seen. No longer did a woman have to wait for a formal event to wear a beautifully crafted dress. Now, she could wear it out on the street, to the office, or to a night out in Soho. Quant was not alone in this revolution. The streets of London became a catwalk for young, bold fashion, and the names that emerged from the era, Twiggy, Jean Shrimpton, and Catherine Deneuve, became synonymous with mod style. Twiggy, with her big eyes, pixie cut, and boyish frame, was the embodiment of the era's androgynous beauty. It was a look that was sleek, clean, and fast, a look that could be paired with go-go boots, shift dresses, and bold geometric patterns. This new aesthetic was as much about a state of mind as it was about fashion. It was about rejecting the past and embracing the possibilities of the future. The cultural movement that mod fashion aligned with was more than just style. The 1960s was a decade defined by radical shifts in politics, civil rights, and social norms. The civil rights movement in the United States, the rise of feminism, the protests against the Vietnam War, and the explosion of youth culture all created a backdrop for fashion that reflected a rejection of authority, of social constructs, and of traditional gender roles. Fashion was, in many ways, a political statement, a visual manifestation of changing ideologies. The 1960s were also a time when the world looked to the stars. The space race was in full swing, and the human race was fascinated by the idea of travel beyond Earth. This fascination with the future found its way into fashion. Designers like Pierre Cardin and André Courrèges embraced the space age aesthetic, introducing sharp lines, metallics, and futuristic materials into their collections. Courrèges, with his clean, minimalist cuts, is credited with popularizing the idea of the moon girl, a woman dressed in sleek silver and white garments that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. Cardin, with his bold, geometric designs and his pioneering use of vinyl, plastic, and other synthetic materials, became the designer of choice for a new generation that wanted to look as if they were from a world of the future. His work was conceptual, sometimes avant-garde, but it resonated with the ethos of the times. Anything was possible, and the future was now. As the decade wore on, another subculture emerged that would define the later years of the 1960s, the hippie movement. Born out of the counterculture and the growing dissatisfaction with the establishment, the hippie movement embraced a style that was as free-spirited as it was revolutionary. The tight-fitting, tailored garments of the mod era gave way to loose, flowing fabrics. Maxi skirts, bell-bottom jeans, and tie-dye became symbols of protest and individuality. This style was all about freedom and rejecting conformity, both in fashion and in life. Hippie style was also about inclusivity. Unlike the exclusive high society fashion that had defined much of the previous decades, hippie style was often handmade, eclectic, and cultural. Clothes were often sourced from second-hand shops or markets, and accessories included anything from beaded necklaces to peace symbols. The designs often drew inspiration from Indian and Eastern cultures, with kaftans, embroidered tunics, and Nehru jackets becoming staples of the era. It was a stark contrast to the sleek, polished look that had dominated in the years prior. But hippie fashion also coincided with political movements and a growing awareness of environmental and social issues. As the Vietnam War raged on, the youth movement protested not just against the war, but against the entire system they saw as oppressive. Fashion, once a symbol of conformity, became a tool for social change. Wearing bell-bottoms and tie-dye wasn't just about looking different. It was about saying something. It was about rejecting the mainstream and embracing a new world order. By the end of the decade, the revolution was beginning to lose its edge. Fashion, once defined by the energy of rebellion, began to be commercialized. The 1970s would see the rise of larger-than-life brands and the increasing influence of corporate America. The simplicity and idealism of the 1960s were replaced by the excess and materialism that would come to define the next decade. But in the 1960s, fashion had made its mark. It was a time when the power of youth, the desire for change, and the fascination with the future came together to create a world that was as dazzling as it was unpredictable. The 1960s proved that fashion could be a force for good, a force for change, and a force for rebellion. It was the decade when the world truly understood that what we wore was a reflection of who we were, who we wanted to be, and who we hoped to become.